It all started with the mailbox. Not my mailbox, exactly, but the post it was attached to. My grandfather had put it in the ground himself sometime around 1965, a solid piece of creosoted cedar that had outlasted 3 mailboxes, 2 governors, and a handful of supposedly superior wood treatments. It leaned a little to the east, like a tired old man squinting into the morning sun, but it was solid. It had character. To the residents of Willow Creek Estates, however, character was apparently a code violation. The first note was polite, in a surgically sterile way. Laminated, tucked under the red flag. It was from the Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee, a phrase so full of self-importance it felt like it should be capitalized and engraved on a granite monument. The note informed me that my mailbox post was not in compliance with Guideline 7.4b, which stipulated that all mailbox posts must be uniform in appearance, constructed of pressure-treated 4x4 lumber, and painted either white or Willow Creek beige. It kindly requested my compliance within 14 days. I read it, chuckled, and tossed it onto the passenger seat of my truck. I was living in my grandparents' old farmhouse, the one they'd kept when they sold the surrounding 200 acres to a developer back in 1987. I'd moved back after a divorce and a job change that allowed for more remote work. My parents still lived just down the road, and the thought of fixing up the old place, of sanding down the floors my grandmother had paced and repairing the porch swing my grandfather had built, felt like coming home in a way I hadn't realized I needed. The house itself sat on a 5-acre plot, an island of old-growth oaks and slightly feral gardens in a sea of perfectly manicured lawns and identical beige houses. My property was, by a quirk of the original sale agreement, technically part of the HOA, a fact that had been a source of occasional low-grade amusement for my grandfather until the day he died. He'd paid his dues, ignored their letters about his vegetable garden, and they'd mostly left him alone. Times, it seemed, had changed. A week later, a second laminated note appeared. This one was less polite. The word uniformity was underlined twice. It mentioned potential fines. I was busy tearing out the old kitchen linoleum, a truly hideous shade of avocado green, and the note joined its predecessor in the growing pile of debris on the truck's floor mat. I was a civil engineer, specializing in land surveying and title research. My days were spent in dusty county archives, deciphering the faded cursive of 19th century deeds and untangling property lines that had been drawn by men who measured distance in chains and landmarks in the Big Rock by the creek. I appreciated order, precision, and rules that made sense. A rule about the color of a mailbox post, especially one that predated the entire subdivision by 2 decades, did not make sense. The third notice wasn't a note. It was a person. Her name, I would soon learn, was Carol Fletcher. She drove a white Lexus SUV that seemed too large for the narrow, winding lanes of the subdivision, and she parked it half on the grass of my front yard, as if the gravel of my driveway might contaminate her tires. She emerged from the vehicle like a general, inspecting a disappointing outpost. She was a woman in her late 50s, dressed in crisp white linen pants and a navy blue top, her blonde hair sculpted into a helmet of unflappable certainty. I was on a ladder, scraping peeling paint from a second-story window frame, covered in white flakes and sweat. I watched her march up the stone walkway, her gaze sweeping across the property and finding fault with everything it touched, the stack of new lumber by the side of the house, the slightly overgrown forsythia bushes, the very ladder I was standing on. "Are you the owner?" she called up, her voice carrying an edge of accusation, as if ownership itself were a suspicious activity. I descended the ladder, wiping my hands on a rag tucked into my jeans. "I am," I said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Carol Fletcher, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing her title at a coronation. "We've sent you 2 notices regarding your non-compliant mailbox post." "Ah, yes, the laminated ones. I got them." I gestured vaguely toward my truck. "I'm a bit busy with the house right now, but it's on the list." It wasn't, but it seemed like the right thing to say. Her eyes narrowed. "The list, Mr. Miller, Jack Miller." "Mr. Miller, the rules of this community are not a list of suggestions you get to when you have a spare moment. They are binding covenants. Your post is an eyesore. It detracts from the cohesive aesthetic we work very hard to maintain." I looked at the old cedar post, its wood weathered to a soft, silvery gray. the grain deepened by half a century of sun and rain. Then I looked past it, at the endless row of identical white posts down the street, each as bland and devoid of history as a plastic fork. "I kinda like it," I said truthfully. "My grandfather put it in." This was clearly the wrong thing to say. A flicker of profound irritation crossed her face. "Your grandfather doesn't live here?" The point of an HOA is to ensure a consistent standard of quality and to protect property values for everyone. When one home is allowed to look rustic, it reflects poorly on the entire neighborhood. The word rustic was delivered with the same distaste one might use for infested. I felt the first spark of real annoyance. I wasn't just some random guy who'd bought a fixer-upper. This was my family's home. This was the house that stood here when all of her precious beige kingdom, was just a hayfield. "I'm in the middle of a major renovation, Carol," I said, my tone a little cooler. "I'm replacing the roof next month, redoing all the plumbing, and updating the wiring. I think the community can survive my mailbox post for a little while longer." "It's not just the post," she pressed on, her voice rising. "It's the commercial vehicle in the driveway." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my Ford F-150. It was 10 years old, had a few dents, and the logo of my small engineering firm on the door. Section 9.2 clearly prohibits the overnight parking of commercial vehicles. "It's my personal truck," I said. "I use it for work. I'm a surveyor. It has lettering on it. That makes it commercial. And the general state of disrepair, the peeling paint, the construction debris." She waved a hand dismissively at the lumber pile. "This isn't what Willow Creek is about. We are a premier community." I could feel my jaw tighten. I'd dealt with difficult county clerks, stubborn lawyers, and belligerent landowners who thought a property line was a suggestion. I had a deep well of patience for professional disagreements. This was different. This wasn't professional, this was personal. "I'm cleaning up the debris this weekend," I said, keeping my voice level. "And the peeling paint is being scraped off, as you can see, so it can be repainted. It's a process." She was not listening. She had the focused, unblinking stare of a predator that has already decided the argument is over and is simply waiting for the capitulation. "I'm going to be frank with you, Mr. Miller," she said, taking a small step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. "I don't know what your situation is or how you came to be in this house, but it's clear you're not a good fit for this community. People who can't or won't maintain our standards, well, frankly, they don't belong here." The words hung in the humid summer air between us. They don't belong here. Spoken to me, on the land my great-grandfather had bought with cash from 2 years of bumper crops. On the spot where my father was born. In front of the house that held almost every significant memory of my childhood. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was stunning. It was so far beyond a simple disagreement about a mailbox post that it left me momentarily speechless. I looked at her. At this woman who had probably moved here from some other state a decade ago, who saw this land not as a place with history and roots, but as a collection of assets whose value had to be protected through aggressive enforcement of beige paint. The spark of annoyance I'd felt earlier ignited into a slow, cold burn of resolve. I gave a short, humorless laugh. "Funny you should say that," I said, my voice quiet. I let the silence stretch for a beat. "My family sold your developer the land for this entire subdivision in 1987. Her smug expression faltered for just a second, a flicker of confusion, then dismissal. "That's irrelevant," she snapped, recovering quickly. "This is about the here and now, the rules. I'm issuing you an official violation for the post, the vehicle, and the debris. You have 7 days to rectify all 3, or a $100 per day fine will be levied. Have a nice day." She turned on her heel, marched back to her oversized Lexus, and drove away, leaving a small, crushed patch of my lawn where her tire had been. I stood there for a long time, ladder forgotten, paint scraper hanging from my hand. The quiet peace I had come here seeking had just been declared a war zone, and Carol Fletcher had no idea who she had just picked a fight with. She saw a guy in dirty jeans with a beat-up truck. She didn't see a man who, for a living, found the exact, legally defensible line where one person's property ended and another's began, and I was starting to feel an urgent need to remind her of a few of those lines. The official violation notice arrived 2 days later via certified mail. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, citing bylaws and covenant sections with a level of detail that was clearly meant to overwhelm and cow the recipient into submission. The fines were, as promised, $100 per day per violation, $300 a day for my mailbox post, my truck, and a neatly stacked pile of lumber. It was absurd. It was extortion. And it was exactly the kind of thing that got my professional blood up. My first instinct was to fight back with reason. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting, which was the following Tuesday. I prepared a small, reasonable presentation. I took photos of the ongoing work on the house to demonstrate my commitment to its upkeep. I made copies of my truck's registration to show it was a personal, not a commercial vehicle. I even found an old photo of my grandfather standing proudly next to the cedar mailbox post shortly after he'd installed it. I thought naively that if I presented my case to the other board members, to my neighbors, they would see the absurdity of Carol's position. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that, like the houses, was a monument to beige. The air inside was stale, smelling of weak coffee and simmering resentment. About 20 people were scattered in folding chairs, facing a long table where Carol sat, flanked by a nervous-looking treasurer and a bored-looking secretary. Carol ran the meeting with the iron-fisted efficiency of a dictator in a banana republic. She brooked no dissent, cut off anyone who rambled, and wielded Robert's rules of order like a weapon. When the floor was opened for homeowner concerns, I stood up and introduced myself. Carol's face tightened into a mask of polite hostility. "Yes, Mr. Miller, we are all well aware of who you are." I ignored the barb and calmly laid out my case. I showed the photos of the renovation. I explained that the lumber was for the new porch railings. I presented the vehicle registration. I even held up the old photo of my grandfather. "This post has been here for over 50 years, I concluded. "It's part of the history of this property. I'm investing a significant amount of money and effort into restoring this home, and I'm asking for a little bit of patience and a simple exemption for a piece of my family's history." I sat down, expecting some discussion, maybe a few questions. Instead, there was silence. Carol let it hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Miller. However, the covenants are clear. Exemptions are not granted for sentimental reasons. To do so would set a precedent that would undermine the very foundation of this community's standards. The violations stand. The fines are accruing. Do you have anything else to add that is not a repeat of your previous points?" I looked around the room. A few people studiously avoided my gaze. Others just stared blankly. No one spoke up. Not a single person. They were either in her camp or too intimidated to challenge her. It was in that moment, in that stale, beige room, that I understood. Reason was not going to work. Logic was irrelevant. This wasn't about a mailbox post. This was about power. My very presence, my history, my quiet refusal to immediately bow to her authority was a threat to her little kingdom. I simply said, "No, nothing further," and sat down. The slow burn of resolve I'd felt in my yard had now cooled into a hard, dense core of purpose. My approach had been all wrong. I had been reacting. It was time to stop reacting and start planning. It was time to do what I do best. It was time to go to the archives. The county records office was my sanctuary. It was a place where sentiment and opinion held no currency. The only things that mattered were lot numbers, parcel maps, deed books, and the unbroken chain of title. It was a world of facts, of hard lines and legal descriptions, and I was more at home there than anywhere else. The next morning, instead of heading to a job site, I drove to the county courthouse, a familiar scent of old paper and dust, greeting me like a friend. I started with the basics. I pulled the master plat for the Willow Creek Estates subdivision, recorded in 1988. It was a sprawling, intricate map, showing every lot, every road, every designated common area. My own 5-acre parcel was clearly marked, a large, rectangular exception in the middle of the neatly curved cul-de-sacs. I spent hours tracing the lines, cross-referencing the developer's plans with the final recorded survey. Most of it was straightforward, exactly as I expected. But surveyors and developers, especially in the rush of a housing boom like the late 80s, can make mistakes. And I had a hunch. My first discovery was small but interesting. The main entrance to the subdivision, a grand affair with a brick sign that read Willow Creek Estates and meticulously planted flower beds, was on a road called Willow Creek Lane. According to the plat, This road was laid over a 30-foot wide access and utility easement. I traced the easement back to its origin. As I suspected, the original grant of easement was from my grandfather to the developer. He had allowed them to build the road over his property to access the land they had bought from him. But the grant was for access only. He had never ceded ownership of the underlying land. The Miller Family Trust, of which I was the current trustee, still owned the ground beneath the first 200 feet of their precious main entrance. The HOA and Carol had been planting petunias and erecting signs on my family's land for 30 years. It was a minor point, legally, but it was a fact, a hard, verifiable fact. I smiled, printed a copy of the deed, and set it aside. I then turned my attention to the common areas. There was a small park, maybe half an acre, with a playground and a white gazebo that was the centerpiece of the community. Carol was particularly proud of it. The HOA newsletter always featured pictures of the annual Founders Day picnic held at the gazebo. I found the parcel on the map, designated Common Area A. I then went to the deed books to trace its transfer from the developer to the homeowners association, and that's when I found it. It was a ghost in the machine, a tiny slip of a pen from decades ago. The legal description of the land the developer had transferred to the HOA contained a subtle error. It referenced a boundary line as north 89 degrees 15 minutes west, 210.5 feet. I went back to the original survey plat. The surveyor's map clearly stated that the line should have been 201.5 feet. Someone, a lawyer, a paralegal, a secretary, had made a typo, a 9-foot typo. That single keystroke error meant that a 9-foot wide strip of land running along the entire western edge of the park had never actually been conveyed to the HOA. And on that 9-foot strip, sitting there as plain as day on the map, was approximately 1/3 of their prize gazebo. The rest of the park was theirs. But the part with the prettiest view, the part where Carol probably stood to give her speeches, was, technically, still owned by the original developer. My heart started beating a little faster. This was more than just a minor curiosity. This was leverage. I spent another hour tracking the developer. The original corporation, McClintock Development, Inc., had been dissolved in 1995. The assets had been rolled into another company, which was then bought by a larger one. But dissolved corporations often have trailing assets that fall into a legal gray area. More importantly, the failure to convey meant the title was clouded. The HOA didn't have a clean and clear title to their own park. I felt a grim satisfaction settling over me, but I wasn't done. Carol's campaign against me felt personal, vindictive. I had a feeling this wasn't just about her love of rules. It was about her love of power, and often, that kind of power comes with financial perks. As a member of the HOA, I was entitled to review its financial records. That evening, I sent a polite, formally worded email to the board's secretary, citing the relevant state statute and HOA bylaw, requesting copies of the complete budget, all vendor contracts, and all paid invoices for the past 3 years. The response, which came from Carol's personal email address less than an hour later, was dripping with condescension. Mr. Miller, while the board recognizes your right to review documents, we find this broad and frankly harassing request to be a waste of our volunteer time. We will compile the documents as our schedules permit. That was all the confirmation I needed. A person with nothing to hide doesn't call a legitimate request for financial records harassing. She was trying to stonewall me, but the law was on my side. I replied with a single sentence. Thank you, I will expect the documents within the 10 business days stipulated by state law. While I waited, the violation notices kept coming. My fines were now in the thousands of dollars. A letter arrived from the HOA's lawyer, a name I recognized from a firm known for aggressive cookie-cutter litigation. It threatened a lien on my property if the fines were not paid and the violations were not cured. I filed it neatly in a growing folder labeled Willow Creek. On the 9th business day, a thick manila envelope appeared on my doorstep. It contained hundreds of pages of financial documents. Carol had complied with the letter of the law, but I could feel her resentment in the disorganized mess of the papers. She'd clearly just dumped everything into a copy machine. It was meant to be another form of intimidation, a data dump designed to be so overwhelming that I would give up. She really underestimated me. I spent the next 2 nights at my kitchen table with a highlighter, a calculator, and several pots of strong coffee. I built a spreadsheet. I organized the vendors, the payment dates, the amounts. And a pattern quickly emerged: landscaping. The HOA was spending an astronomical amount on landscaping: mowing, fertilizing, planting seasonal flowers, trimming trees. The contract was with a company called Lawnscapes Unlimited. They were by far the HOA's single largest expense, pulling in over $40,000 a year. And they got every single job: the new mulch for the playground, the removal of a storm-damaged tree, the replanting of the flower beds at the entrance. No competitive bids, ever. $40,000 was high for a neighborhood this size, but not insane. What was insane was the additional invoices: $15,000 for the gazebo refurbishment project last spring, $2,500 for seasonal decorative gourd arrangement in the fall. The numbers felt inflated, padded. I opened my laptop and did a state business entity search for Lawnscapes Unlimited. The company was an LLC, formed 6 years ago. The registered agent and sole officer was listed as a Mr. David Fletcher. Fletcher. The name was right there, sitting on the tip of my brain. Carol Fletcher. I stood up from my table and walked into my office. My father had been the unofficial town historian for years. When he downsized, he'd given me boxes of old high school yearbooks. I found the one from 1985. I flipped through the pages until I got to the F's, and there she was, Carol Paskey at the time. A few pages later, David Fletcher. It wasn't conclusive. But then I remembered something else. My mother was a world-class gossip. I called her. After 10 minutes of catching up, I casually asked, "Hey Mom, do you know that woman Carol Fletcher, who runs the HOA over at Willow Creek?" "Oh heavens, yes," she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "Her poor sister, married to that David Fletcher. He's had one failed business after another. I heard he's doing landscaping now. Carol's always trying to help him out, bless her heart." Bingo. David Fletcher was Carol's brother-in-law. She had been funneling tens of thousands of dollars of HOA funds, year after year, to her sister's husband, using inflated no-bid contracts. It was a clear conflict of interest, a breach of her fiduciary duty to the association, and very likely illegal. I sat back in my chair, the pile of invoices on one side of me, the county plat maps on the other. I now had the road, the gazebo, and the money. I had all the facts I needed, all the hard lines. Carol had built her little kingdom on a foundation of arrogance and deceit, and I was about to show her that the whole structure was sitting on land that didn't belong to her, both literally and figuratively. The time for defense was over. It was time to draw a new map. I let a week pass. The fines continued to accumulate. The threatening letters continued to arrive. I ignored them all. I was no longer a resident being harassed. I was a surveyor preparing his report. My plan required a specific venue, a public forum where the maximum number of residents would be present to witness the outcome. The annual budget ratification meeting was in 2 weeks. It was always the best attended meeting of the year, as it determined the following year's HOA dues. It was the perfect stage. First, I needed to legally solidify my position regarding the gazebo. I paid a visit to an old family friend, a real estate lawyer named Tom Peterson, who had handled my grandfather's estate. Tom was semi-retired, sharp as a tack, and had a deep-seated loathing for overzealous HOAs. He'd listened to my story, reviewed the deeds and the plat maps, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "She picked the wrong guy to bully, Jack," he said, chuckling. "This is beautiful. The title flaw is undeniable." He explained that to clear the title, the HOA would need a quitclaim deed from the successor entity of the original developer. Finding that entity and getting them to sign would be a legal and bureaucratic nightmare, costing them thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success. Then I laid out the financial documents. Tom's smile vanished, replaced by a grim frown. "This is worse than I thought. This isn't just bad governance, this is straight-up self-dealing. Breach of fiduciary duty is a serious claim, and you've got the receipts to prove it." Together, we drafted a series of documents. First, a formal letter on Tom's legal letterhead, addressed to the Willow Creek HOA Board of Directors. It was a masterpiece of polite, professional menace. It didn't make accusations. It simply inquired. It requested clarification on the ownership status and maintenance responsibilities for the land underlying Willow Creek Lane, citing the original easement. It requested a copy of the title insurance policy for Common Area A, noting a potential discrepancy in the legal description found in the public record. Finally, it requested a copy of the board's conflict of interest policy and all disclosure forms related to the contracts awarded to Lawnscapes Unlimited. We sent it via certified mail. Return receipt requested. Time to arrive exactly 1 week before the annual meeting. It was the first shot across the bow, a warning flare to see how they would react. I also spent a day preparing my presentation for the meeting. I wasn't going to use blurry photos of my house this time. I went to a print shop and had large poster-sized copies made of the relevant sections of the 1988 subdivision plat. I highlighted the easement for the entrance road. I drew a bright red line showing the 9-foot strip of land that cut through the park and the gazebo. I also created a simple, powerful chart summarizing the payments to Lawnscapes Unlimited over the past 3 years, showing the total amount and the lack of any competitive bids. Everything was clear, visual, and backed by public records. I was bringing the archives to them. The certified letter was signed for by Carol herself. For 3 days, there was silence. I imagined the frantic phone calls, the panicked meetings between her and her brother-in-law. She was cornered, but I knew she was too arrogant to back down. Her entire identity in that community was built on being the unassailable authority. To admit a mistake, let alone corruption, was not in her nature. She would do what all bullies do when challenged with facts. She would double down. Her response came in the form of the official agenda for the annual meeting, emailed to all residents. Under New Business, she had added an item: discussion and vote on sanctions against homeowner at Lot 1 for continued and willful violations of community covenants. She was going to try to use the meeting to publicly humiliate me, to rally the residents against me and paint me as a troublemaker, hoping to bury my legitimate inquiries under a wave of public outrage. It was exactly what I had hoped she would do. She was walking right into the center of the trap. The night of the annual meeting, the clubhouse was packed. People were standing along the walls. The budget and the promise of a public flogging had brought everyone out. I saw neighbors who had previously been friendly now averting their eyes. I saw the core group of Carol's supporters sitting in the front row, their faces set in grim, judgmental lines. I found a seat in the back, my portfolio with my poster boards resting against my chair. Carol, looking severe and powerful in a dark pantsuit, called the meeting to order. They went through the old business, the treasurer's report, the ratification of the budget. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was just waiting for the main event. Finally, she arrived at my item on the agenda. "And now," she said, her voice ringing with theatrical gravity, "we must address a serious issue, the continued and willful violations of Mr. Jack Miller at Lot 1. She launched into a 10-minute tirade detailing my non-compliant mailbox, my commercial vehicle, my construction debris, and my failure to pay the now substantial fines. She painted me as an outsider who had no respect for the community, for his neighbors, or for the rules that protected their property values. And now," she continued, her voice rising to a crescendo, "instead of taking responsibility, Mr. Miller has engaged in a campaign of harassment against this board. He has buried us in frivolous document requests and sent threatening letters from his lawyer, all in an attempt to intimidate us, to bully us into carving out a special exception for him. We are here tonight to send a message that the rules apply to everyone. I am asking for a motion to authorize the board to place a lien on Mr. Miller's property and to pursue all legal avenues to force his compliance." A man in the front row, one of her cronies, immediately made the motion. Another seconded it. The room was buzzing. Carol looked at me, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with false magnanimity, "does the accused have anything to say before the community votes on this motion?" This was my moment. I calmly picked up my portfolio and walked to the front of the room. I didn't look at her. I addressed my neighbors. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I do." I unrolled my first poster, the plat map of the subdivision entrance, and taped it to the wall. "Before you vote to place a lien on my property for parking my truck in my own driveway," I began, pointing to the highlighted easement, "you should all be aware that the very road you drove on to get here tonight, Willow Creek Lane, is a private access easement. The land underneath it is not owned by the HOA. It is still owned by my family's trust. For 30 years, this association has been maintaining, landscaping, and placing signs on property that does not belong to it. While we appreciate you keeping our property looking so nice, your authority as an HOA ends where my property line begins. A murmur went through the crowd. I could see people turning to each other, confused. Carol's face had gone rigid. I taped up my second poster, the one showing the park and the gazebo, with the bright red line slicing through it. "And this," I said, my voice still calm, "is Common Area A, your park and your gazebo." I tapped the red line. According to the deeds on file at the county courthouse, this 9-foot wide strip of land was, due to a clerical error in 1988, never actually transferred to the HOA. It remains the property of the original developer, a now defunct corporation. This means that a significant portion of your most valuable community asset, the gazebo you spent $15,000 of HOA funds renovating last year, is sitting on land you do not own. You do not have clear title. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd imagine that's a significant problem. The murmuring grew louder. The faces in the front row that had been so smug were now etched with worry. They were homeowners. They understood what a title defect meant. I saw the board's treasurer lean over and whisper frantically to Carol, who waved him away. "And that brings me to the $15,000 for the gazebo," I said, turning to my final chart, the one detailing the payments to Lawnscapes Unlimited. I taped it to the wall. "And the $40,000 a year for landscaping, and the $2,500 for gourds, all paid to one company, Lawnscapes Unlimited, no bids, ever." I paused and looked directly at Carol for the first time. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and panic. "I was curious about this exclusive and very expensive company," I said, letting my voice fill the now silent room. "So I looked it up. It's owned by a man named David Fletcher. Carol, isn't that your brother-in-law?" The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial-grade carpet. Every eye in the room swiveled from the chart to me and finally landed on Carol. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. "You have accused me of not belonging here," I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "You have fined me, threatened me, and tried to publicly humiliate me over a mailbox post my grandfather installed. All the while, you have been using your position as president of this HOA to funnel tens of thousands of dollars of your neighbors' money to your own family. You have been a poor steward of this community's finances and an even poorer steward of its land, failing to even secure clear title to your own park. So, I would ask my neighbors to consider, before you vote on this ridiculous motion against me, who here truly does not respect this community? Who here truly does not belong?" I picked up my empty portfolio and walked back to my seat. The silence held for another 10 seconds, and then the room erupted. It wasn't a debate. It was an explosion of outrage. People were shouting questions at Carol. The treasurer was trying to speak, looking terrified. The man who had made the motion to sanction me was now on his feet yelling, "Is this true, Carol?" Carol stood there, speechless, for a moment longer. Then she found her voice. It was shrill, panicked. "This is an outrage. These are lies. He is a disgruntled homeowner trying to deflect from his own violations." But it was too late. The evidence was literally on the wall. My calm, factual presentation versus her shrieking, unsupported denials. No one was buying it. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had inverted with the force of a tidal wave. Her authority, so absolute just moments before, had completely evaporated, replaced by suspicion and contempt. The meeting descended into chaos. The motion against me was forgotten. Calls for Carol's immediate resignation and a full, independent audit echoed through the clubhouse. I didn't stay to watch the rest. My work was done. I slipped out the back door into the cool night air. As I walked home under the old oak trees that lined my driveway, I could still hear the shouting from the clubhouse behind me. It was the sound of a petty tyrant's reign coming to a messy, public, and richly deserved end. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Carol resigned from the board via email the next morning. The remaining board members, in a desperate act of self-preservation, immediately voted to hire an outside forensic accounting firm to conduct a full audit. They also suspended all payments to Lawnscapes Unlimited pending the results. Within a month, the audit was complete. It confirmed everything I had uncovered and more. Years of no-bid contracts, inflated invoices, and payments for work that was never even done. The total amount of misdirected funds was well over $100,000. The new HOA board, led by a quiet accountant who lived 3 doors down from me, sent a formal demand letter to Carol and her brother-in-law, seeking full restitution. When that was ignored, they filed a civil lawsuit. The local paper even ran a small story about it, headlined, "Subdivision in Turmoil Over Allegations of Embezzlement." Carol's social standing in the community was not just damaged, it was obliterated. A "for sale" sign appeared in her yard 2 months after the meeting. It stayed there for nearly a year. Apparently, news of the lawsuit and the scandal made the house a tough sell. Eventually, a young family bought it for significantly less than her asking price. I saw her once during the move. She was loading boxes into a U-Haul, looking tired and drawn. She saw me watching from my porch, and her face hardened into a familiar mask of hate. She got into her Lexus and drove away, leaving Willow Creek for good. The new board approached me with a level of humility that was almost comical in its contrast to Carol's reign. They rescinded all my fines, of course. Then they asked for my help. I met with them, not in the clubhouse, but at my kitchen table, over coffee. I walked them through the title issues with the entrance and the park. I had no desire to be a landlord to the entire subdivision, nor did I want to take their gazebo away. That was never the point. The point was about respect. For history, for property lines, for the simple truth. I agreed to grant a new, more formal easement for the entrance road and to sign a quitclaim deed for the 9-foot strip of the park, clearing their title. In return, they agreed to amend the HOA covenants. We drafted a historic property clause, exempting my lot from a list of aesthetic rules, including those governing mailboxes, fences, and outbuildings, in recognition of its pre-subdivision origin. They also formally acknowledged my right to park my work truck on my own property. They voted on the amendments at the next meeting. The vote was unanimous. Life in Willow Creek settled into a new kind of quiet, a genuine quiet, not the tense, enforced silence of Carol's rule. People started talking to each other more. The new board was transparent, posting the budget online and holding open forums. Neighbors who had shunned me now waved when I drove past. A few even stopped by to apologize for not speaking up at that first meeting. I always told them the same thing. She was intimidating. I get it. I finished the renovations on the old farmhouse. The new roof was on, the windows were glazed and painted, and the porch swing my grandfather built hung from new chains, ready for another generation. One evening, I was sitting on that swing, a cold beer in my hand, watching the fireflies begin to dot the twilight in the field behind my house. The sounds from the subdivision, a distant lawnmower, the laughter of kids playing, were just a gentle hum in the background. I thought about Carol and her bitter parting glare. She truly believed I didn't belong, but she was wrong. She had only ever lived on the surface of this place, on a thin layer of asphalt and manicured sod laid over land she never bothered to understand. My family's story was in the soil itself, in the roots of the old oaks and the foundation stones of the house. I had simply reminded everyone where the real lines were drawn. The peace I had come here to find had been threatened, but in fighting for it, I had secured it more deeply than I ever could have imagined. I took a sip of my beer, leaned my head back, and watched the stars begin to appear in the wide-open country sky. I was home, and I belonged here more than anyone.